After buying a 400-year-old house, Evelyn Moore expected to deal with creaky floors and crumbling walls, but when she started restoring the backyard, she made a shocking discovery no one saw coming. Beneath the weeds and dirt, a rusted hatch led to a secret underground chamber, and what she found inside revealed a hidden history that had been buried for generations. What began as a home renovation turned into something far more powerful. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. Her name was Evelyn Moore, a 39-year-old restorer from Vermont, known more for her quiet patience than for making bold choices. But after a decade of restoring antique furniture in a cramped third-floor apartment in Boston, she was ready for something bigger, something permanent. She'd always had a strange reverence for time-worn places. The cracks in the floorboards, the stories held in peeling wallpaper, they weren't flaws to her. They were whispers. And when she stumbled upon the listing of a 400-year-old stone cottage in upstate New York, nearly swallowed by ivy and neglect, she didn't hesitate. The roof sagged like a tired brow, the windows were clouded with age, and the garden had turned into a wild jungle. But she saw it. She saw a home. The villagers nearby warned her gently, calling it the Old Silence House. Most had forgotten why it had earned that name, but to Evelyn, that only deepened the mystery. She moved in during early autumn, just as the leaves began to crisp. Her hands, skilled from years of delicate refinishing, now turned to beams and bricks. She believed she was restoring a house. What she didn't know was that the house and what lay just beyond it was about to restore something in her. It began with the garden. Evelyn had set aside her Sunday mornings for taming it, a quiet ritual she'd grown fond of. There was something healing in clearing vines, tugging at roots, and uncovering what had once been a space filled with life. She imagined children chasing each other between hedges, an old woman snipping herbs into a wicker basket, maybe even lovers stealing quiet conversations beneath the apple tree that now stood half dead. But on one particular morning, with a mug of coffee cooling on a stone bench nearby, her shovel struck something hard beneath the soil. At first, she thought it was rock, but when she knelt and brushed the earth away with her gloved hands, the surface that emerged was unmistakably man-made flat, metallic, and far too deliberate to be a natural formation. It was an old hatch. The iron was pitted with rust, the edges wrapped in decades of stubborn soil, but there was a handle, just barely. Her breath caught in her throat. She touched it. It was colder than the morning air, even in the weak autumn sun. She didn't open it that day. Instead, she sat back on her heels and stared at it, her mind racing with questions she wasn't ready to answer. What was something like this doing here? Buried under layers of earth in a garden that was supposed to be little more than an overgrown patch of roses. For the next few days, Evelyn tried to ignore it. She returned to the house, sanding wooden beams, replastering cracked walls, sealing windows against the oncoming chill. But the image of the hatch haunted her. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the glass, seemed to whisper its presence. By Thursday evening, she couldn't resist. She returned to the garden with a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the tangled branches. She crouched beside the hatch and began to dig in earnest. The soil gave way easier than she expected, as if the ground itself had grown tired of hiding its secret. When she finally pried it open, the hinges groaned like an animal disturbed from deep sleep. The smell that wafted out was a mix of wet earth, old metal, and something else, something Evelyn couldn't name but felt in her chest like a held breath. She pointed her flashlight downward. There was a ladder. The rungs were iron, bolted into a narrow shaft that disappeared into darkness. Evelyn hesitated. Her fingers trembled against the handle. She wasn't reckless. She'd never been impulsive. But something about this, something about the way the hatch had waited, sealed, buried. It felt like it wasn't just calling her curiosity. It was calling her specifically. She secured a rope to a nearby tree, looped it around her waist like she'd seen in mountain climbing documentaries, and tested the first rung. It held. One breath, one step, then another. The light above her dimmed with each descent, until the only thing she could hear was her own breath bouncing against the cold stone walls. She counted the rungs 12, then 20, then 30. Finally, her boots touched earth. She stood in a small chamber. The floor was damp, the walls stone, and the ceiling low enough that she had to duck. Her flashlight traced along the walls, revealing shelves carved into the stone, rusted cans, tattered blankets, glass bottles clouded with dust. But it wasn't the objects that made her gasp. It was the writing. On the far wall, scrawled in charcoal or soot, were words. Wait, night, fear, not safe above. We stay until the silence. Evelyn's hand flew to her chest. Her flashlight trembled slightly in her grip. These weren't the graffiti of trespassers. This was something much older, something written with urgency. She stepped forward, running her fingers along the words, smudging the dust, feeling the texture of history etched into stone. She sank to her knees, overwhelmed. Who had hidden here? Who had written these messages? Had they survived? Had they ever left? She found scraps of what looked like bedding old cloth disintegrating at her touch. A pair of broken reading glasses. A tin box filled with yellowed paper that dissolved when she tried to lift it. She handled everything like relics from a tomb. Because in a way, that's what this was. A hidden tomb of memory, of fear, of survival. The air felt heavier now, not because of dust or moisture, but because of presence. Evelyn wasn't alone, not in a ghostly sense, but in a historical one. The room was thick with lives that had once huddled in the dark, waiting for danger to pass. When she finally climbed back up into the night air, the stars above her seemed distant, the wind colder than before. She closed the hatch gently and sat beside it, her flashlight dim now, the battery fading. Tears slid down her cheeks, not from fear, not from sadness, but from reverence. She thought she'd come here to restore a house, but what she found was something that needed far more than sanding and paint. It needed to be remembered. 3 days after discovering the underground chamber. Evelyn returned to it, this time, not with fear, but with a strange sense of duty. She didn't know why the space had been buried, or what exactly it had witnessed, but something inside her whispered, it was waiting for someone to remember. She brought gloves, a dust mask, a stronger flashlight, and a notepad. Every instinct told her she shouldn't go alone. But she also knew that some things you have to face in solitude first. The hatch creaked as she opened it again. The smell hadn't changed, wet stone, old metal, something faintly earthy and sorrowful. She descended the iron ladder more confidently this time. The rungs groaned under her weight, and the chill of the underground wrapped around her like an old, familiar blanket. When her boots hit the soil floor, she paused and simply listened. Silence, stillness, but not emptiness. The writings on the wall still gave her chills. Wait, night, fear, not safe above. She traced the words again with her fingers, then turned her light to a corner she hadn't explored last time, where the stone wall met a heap of debris. There were splintered boards, a pile of earth, and what looked like a collapsed section of brick. She crouched, set her flashlight down, and began clearing it away slowly, carefully, reverently. That's when her hand hit something that wasn't rock or wood. Metal, smooth, cold, rectangular. She froze, gently brushing the dirt aside. She uncovered a small, rusted box, no larger than a shoebox. The lock had long since corroded away. She opened it. Inside, a child's handkerchief, delicately embroidered with the initials L.T., a pair of broken eyeglasses, and most hauntingly, a diary. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed and curled. She handled it with care, as if touching something sacred. The handwriting was messy but legible. The first page read, March 3rd of 1942. The sirens screamed again last night. Mama said we had to go down. Said this place was ours, even if they didn't give it to us. Daddy said not to cry, but I did anyway. Evelyn sat down on the dirt floor and read in the dim light, her hands trembling. Page after page revealed a child's account of life hiding beneath the earth, a family who had built this chamber because they weren't allowed in the public shelters during the war. They said those places weren't for us, that we had to find somewhere else. The words hit Evelyn like a punch to the chest. This wasn't just a war shelter. It was a refuge for the excluded. The child, likely a girl named Lydia Thompson, based on later entries, had documented everything, the fear, the cold, the hope that things would change. Her last entry was short, desperate. It's been 3 nights. No one has come. Daddy says it's safe now, but Mama won't stop crying. I miss the sun. I miss the sky. I miss being seen. Evelyn pressed the book to her chest and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the kind of quiet, aching sobs that come when truth and grief collapse into each other. When she finally looked up, her flashlight had fallen sideways and was casting light along the far wall. And that's when she saw it. A seam in the brick, subtle, but there. She stood, approached, and ran her fingers along the uneven surface. The mortar here was different, more recent, maybe even rushed. Her breath quickened. Without thinking, she grabbed a nearby rock and began tapping gently at the mortar. Dust fell. Then a crack. Then a brick shifted. She paused. The air shifted too. Something old and stale and buried pushed back into the space, like breath exhaled after decades of silence. One more push, and the brick fell inward with a thud. Behind it, darkness. Evelyn's flashlight beam pierced the hole. Another chamber? She widened the opening and squeezed through, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Inside, the space was slightly larger. The walls were bare, but the floor was not. Scattered across the dirt were objects: a tiny wooden toy train, a pair of worn women's shoes, a tattered wool coat, and a necklace, a simple silver chain, tarnished but intact, with a tiny locket still clinging to it. Inside the locket, she found a photo. It was faded, but clear enough to make out a family, a man, a woman, and a young girl. All smiling, all dressed in their best, a moment captured, before fear drove them underground. Evelyn fell to her knees. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a home, even if only for a time, a place of love and memory and survival built beneath a world that refused to see them. And now, decades later, it had been found, not by accident, but maybe by purpose. For days after discovering the second chamber, Evelyn Moore couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the locket. She saw the little girl's embroidered handkerchief. She heard Lydia's voice in her head. Read again and again those trembling lines, "I miss the sun." I miss being seen. The restoration work upstairs lost all meaning. Peeling wallpaper and squeaky floorboards didn't matter now, not when there were stories buried beneath her feet. Stories no one had bothered to tell. She sat in the garden every morning beside the hatch, coffee untouched, journal in her lap. For hours. She wrote not about paint colors or renovation plans, but about Lydia, her family, and the chilling realization that no one had remembered them. That's what stung the most. It wasn't just that the family had been excluded from public shelters. It was that, for over 80 years, no one had come looking, no one had honored their courage, no one had even known they existed. And now that Evelyn did know, she couldn't go back to living like she didn't. She began researching, diving deep into town archives, yellowed newspapers, handwritten census records. The local library became her second home. She spent hours combing through microfilm reels, scanning page after page for the Thompson family. Nothing. No mention of Lydia, no mention of the shelter, just polite erasures. It wasn't until she stumbled upon a single, brief article dated April 1942, buried on page 6 of the Town Gazette, that the pieces began to fit. Work camps established for factory laborers on outskirts of Cold Hollow Valley. Temporary quarters set up for colored workers and their families. That was it. No names, no records, just a footnote in history. Evelyn leaned back in the library chair, heart thudding. They had lived here. They had worked here. And yet, they were invisible. That night, she returned to the chamber again, this time not as a restorer, but as a listener. She sat on the dirt floor, flashlight flickering, diary in her hands. She whispered aloud some of Lydia's entries, her voice trembling in the cold air. Daddy says not to cry, but I did anyway. They said the big shelter's not for people like us. Mama says we stay quiet so the world forgets we're even here. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. The stones around her seemed to absorb the words, welcoming them back after decades of silence. She looked around the space again, not with fear this time, but with a sense of belonging. It was as if the chamber itself had been waiting for someone to remember. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. For most of her life, Evelyn had admired history from a distance. She'd restored furniture, honored old wood, repaired time-worn pieces with reverence. But she'd never thought about whose history got preserved and whose didn't. This place had shown her the ugly truth: some stories are buried on purpose. And yet, she had uncovered one. She had heard it, and now she carried it. She realized then restoration isn't just about wood and stone. It's about memory. It's about truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. A few days later, she drove to the edge of town and knocked on the door of a woman named Mrs. Geneva Rollins, a 92-year-old resident listed as one of the oldest living locals. Evelyn had found her name scribbled in the corner of an old community census from the 1940s. Mrs. Rollins opened the door slowly, leaning on her cane, her eyes sharp despite her age. "I'm looking for someone who remembers the old work camps," Evelyn said softly. There was a pause. Then the old woman nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes, child," she whispered. "I remember." She invited Evelyn in and poured her tea with trembling hands. And for the next 2 hours, she told stories no one else had bothered to record about the black families who came north to help in the factories, about how they weren't allowed in the air raid shelters, about how some of them built a place for themselves out near the old orchard. Quiet folk, kept to themselves. Evelyn showed her the locket. Mrs. Rollins took it in both hands, gasped quietly, then began to cry. "I remember her," she said. "That little girl. She used to pick wildflowers. Her mama made the best cornbread in the valley." And just like that, Lydia Thompson was real again, not just ink on a page, not just whispers in a chamber, but a child remembered by name. Evelyn drove home that night with the locket clutched in her palm and her heart pounding with purpose. She wasn't just a restorer anymore. She was a witness. And maybe that was the most important restoration of all, not of old houses, but of forgotten truths. Something changed in Evelyn Moore the night she held that locket in her hand. Before, the chamber had felt like a discovery, mysterious, chilling, and private. But now it felt like a calling. For days. She couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Rollins had said. She used to pick wildflowers. Just that small memory had cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for nearly a century. Lydia Thompson had lived, had laughed, had been loved, and Evelyn couldn't let that fade again. She sat at her kitchen table the next morning. Diary pages laid out in protective sleeves, the locket resting in a small velvet pouch. Around her were photos, newspaper clippings, names, sketches of the chamber's underground. She looked down at it all and whispered, "It's not enough to know. I have to do something." That's when the idea came, not just to preserve the space, but to transform it. Not into a museum. No. She didn't want velvet ropes or ticket counters. She wanted something deeper, something that honored the humanity of the space. She envisioned it as a living memorial, a place where stories could breathe again, where students could come and read Lydia's diary, where neighbors could descend into the chamber and feel what silence used to sound like, where a child could look at the toy train on the floor and understand what war had taken from people like Lydia's family and what they had fought to keep. Dignity, resilience, legacy. Evelyn opened her laptop and typed into the search bar, "How to register a historical site." The process wasn't easy. There were forms, inspections, endless phone calls. And at every turn, officials asked the same questions with raised eyebrows. "Are you sure this was real? Why hasn't this come up before? Do you have proof?" She showed them the diary, the artifacts, the testimony from Mrs. Rollins. Still, some were polite but distant. Others were openly dismissive. One local administrator even told her flatly, "It's not the kind of history people around here are eager to dig up again." Evelyn stared at him, stunned, then stood tall and replied, "Then maybe it's exactly the kind of history we need to face." And not everyone was against her. Word began to spread. A librarian she'd met connected her with a local history professor who offered to carbon date the artifacts and verify the materials in the chamber. A preservation society in Albany reached out after seeing a thread Evelyn had posted online, asking if she'd consider a grant application. One day, while standing outside her home with a clipboard and a determination bigger than her fear, a young teacher from a nearby school approached her. "I heard about the chamber," she said. "Would you be willing to speak to our 8th graders? We're doing a unit on unsung voices in American history." Evelyn blinked. It wasn't a grant. It wasn't a formal title, but it was something far more precious. A beginning. She agreed to the talk, and a week later, found herself standing in front of 28 middle schoolers with wide eyes and restless feet. She brought the locket in a glass case, a scanned copy of Lydia's diary, and she told them the story not as a professor, not as a historian, but as a woman who had found something buried and listened. When she read aloud Lydia's words, "I miss being seen," the room went quiet. You could hear the hum of the lights overhead. And one student, a boy in the back, raised his hand and said softly, "Do you think she ever came out?" Evelyn's throat tightened. "I don't know," she answered, "but I think maybe. She's finally being seen now." That single classroom visit turned into 3, then 5. Soon, Evelyn was being invited to speak at libraries, community centers, even a small local college. What started as a renovation had become a movement quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. Neighbors who once smiled politely but never asked questions began stopping by. Some brought stories passed down through generations. Others brought tears, apologies, or simply open ears. One older man, who had lived in the valley his entire life, came by with an envelope. Inside were 3 black and white photographs. One showed the edge of the orchard where Evelyn's house now stood. The others showed people black families, barefoot children, a woman stirring something in a cast-iron pot. He said, "My granddad took these during the war. He never talked much. Maybe you'll know what to do with them." Evelyn held the photographs like treasures, because that's exactly what they were. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was building something that would outlast her. Not just a restored house, but a place of memory. And what she found in the backyard, it hadn't just shocked everyone. It had changed them. It was a gray morning when Evelyn Moore walked out to the hatch again, this time not with a flashlight or toolbox, but with a folded chair and a basket of letters. The wind carried the scent of rain. The sky hung low, heavy, like it, too, held something it needed to release. She sat by the hatch and opened Lydia's diary again, her copy now, the original stored safely behind glass inside the house. She turned to the final page, the ink faded but readable. "If someone ever reads this, I hope you remember us. We were here. We were real." The first time Evelyn read that line, she wept. But today, she didn't cry. Today, she read it aloud, clearly, slowly, as if reading it to Lydia herself. That same afternoon, a letter arrived in her mailbox, one she hadn't expected. It was from the Thompson Family Descendants Association. A distant cousin, Marilyn Thompson, had read about Evelyn's discovery through a viral post shared on social media. After weeks of tracing records, she wrote, "Lydia Thompson was my grandmother's sister. We thought she'd died in the war. My family never knew what happened to her. But thanks to you, now we do." Evelyn's knees buckled as she finished the letter. They were alive. The family was still out there. She wasn't just preserving forgotten stories, she was returning them. 2 weeks later, Marilyn came to visit. She was in her early 70s, with soft, weathered hands and eyes full of caution and memory. Evelyn welcomed her into the house with tea and silence at first. Then Marilyn asked, "Can I see it?" They walked to the hatch together. When they descended into the chamber, Marilyn took each step with care, almost reverence. She stood in the middle of the room, looking at the walls, the words, the locket in the case. And then she began to cry. Not the kind of weeping that breaks suddenly, but a slow, tremulous grief, the kind passed down through bloodlines, tucked quietly into the silences of generations. "My grandmother never talked about Lydia," she whispered, "said it hurt too much." She stepped toward the wall where Lydia had written, "We stay until the silence." Marilyn pressed her palm to the stone and closed her eyes. "I think she was waiting for someone like you." Evelyn's throat tightened. She looked at this woman, this living thread between past and present, and realized something profound. She was no longer the keeper of someone else's story. She was now a part of it. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn and Marilyn worked side by side. They collected oral histories, scanned family photos, contacted other descendants. Together, they began creating a living archive, a room in Evelyn's home filled with handwritten letters, voice recordings, digital renderings of the underground chambers, and most importantly, names. For the first time, the names of the people who had hidden underground would be spoken aloud. They wouldn't be just workers, or families, or colored laborers. They would be remembered as Lydia, Clara, Isaiah, Ruth, James, real people, real voices, real pain and real courage. Then one day, something happened that Evelyn would never forget. A school group came to visit the third that month. They were children from a city an hour away, most of them 10 or 11 years old. Bright eyes, chattering mouths, clumsy feet. Evelyn gave her talk as usual, walking them through the restored chamber, telling Lydia's story. And then she read the line from the diary. "I miss being seen." The room quieted. And one little girl, black, with long braids and a shy voice, raised her hand and asked, "Miss Evelyn, do you think Lydia was brave?" Evelyn looked at her, really looked. She saw the weight of the question, the longing behind it, the unspoken hope. Please tell me that someone who looks like me could be brave, too. Evelyn knelt to meet her gaze and said, voice trembling, "I think Lydia was the bravest person I've ever met." The girl nodded slowly. And then, in front of the whole group, she stepped forward, placed her hand on the cold brick wall, and whispered, "Thank you, Lydia." Evelyn broke. Tears spilled freely. She turned away, pretending to fix her glasses, but every child in that room saw it, and somehow, they all understood. That day, they didn't just learn history. They connected to it, and Evelyn knew this is what healing looks like. One voice at a time, one name at a time, one child at a time. That evening, as the sun sank and lit the garden in amber gold, Evelyn sat on her porch, wrapped in a blanket. The hatch was closed. But in her heart, it was wide open, and the silence that once haunted her, now it sang. It sang of names rediscovered, of stories reclaimed, of a woman who came to restore a house and ended up restoring history. The day the site was officially recognized as a historical place of remembrance. Evelyn stood alone by the hatch, her fingers lightly grazing the cold, rusted handle. There was no ceremony, no stage, no flashing cameras or scripted speeches, just her, and the wind, and the memory of Lydia Thompson blowing through the trees, whispering from the bricks. It had taken months of paperwork, advocacy, and endless hours digging not just through dirt, but through denial, silence, and selective memory. But the truth had surfaced, and with it, a forgotten history finally allowed to breathe again. That afternoon, a wooden sign was installed at the edge of her garden. It read, "The Thompson Refuge, a memorial to the forgotten families of Cold Hollow Valley, 1942. We were here. We were real. We remember." When Evelyn first read those words etched into oak, her eyes welled up with tears she didn't try to hide. She hadn't written them for herself. She had written them for every person who had ever been told they were invisible, for every family who had been pushed into silence, for every child who had waited in the dark, longing to be seen. In the following weeks, visitors began arriving not in crowds, but in quiet, meaningful waves. A veteran who remembered rumors of the underground folks during the war, a woman whose grandmother worked in the same orchard Lydia once played beside, a teacher who brought students to learn not just facts, but empathy. Some came and left flowers. Others sat beside the chamber in silence, hands folded, eyes closed. A few left notes, tucked between bricks. For Lydia, I see you now. To the families who built what others refused to share, we honor you. And Evelyn, she welcomed them all with tea, with warmth, and with stories. She had become something she never expected a keeper of memory. Not because she asked to be, but because the past had chosen her to carry it forward. One autumn evening, just as golden leaves began to fall across the yard, Evelyn received a letter in the mail. No return address, just a simple envelope, and inside, a photograph. Black and white, slightly faded, but unmistakable. It showed a little girl smiling wide, arms around a ragged doll standing in front of what looked like a brick-lined tunnel. Beside her, a woman knelt, holding a basket of laundry, and in the background, the stone foundation of Evelyn's house. On the back, in careful handwriting, Lydia and Mama, 1942. Evelyn sat on her porch for a long time after that, the photo trembling in her hand. She whispered, "I know. I see you." And for the first time since she'd moved in, the house no longer felt haunted. It felt complete. What began as a personal project to restore an old house had become a mission of the heart. Evelyn had peeled back layers of wallpaper. Yes, but more than that, she had peeled back layers of silence. She had found not just a chamber, but a community lost to history. She had found not just a diary, but a voice echoing through time. She had found not just tragedy, but resilience, pride, and truth. And the most beautiful part, she had not done it alone. Lydia's descendants, the neighbors, the students, the teachers, the strangers who came with tears in their eyes and stories in their hearts, they had become part of the restoration. Too. Not of the house, but of something far greater dignity. Evelyn's story began in search of peace and quiet. But the silence she found wasn't empty. It was full with sorrow, with strength, with sacred memory. And as she stood in her backyard one final time, looking down at the hatch beneath the falling leaves, she knew something she hadn't known a year ago. The past doesn't die, it waits. Waits to be uncovered, waits to be heard, waits for anyone to care enough to ask what's beneath the surface. Evelyn had asked. She had listened. And because she did, a little girl who once whispered, "I miss being seen," would never be forgotten again. History doesn't always live in books or monuments. Sometimes it sleeps in silence, buried under soil, behind walls, or in the hearts of those who were never allowed to tell their stories. Evelyn Moore thought she was restoring a house, but what she truly restored was a voice that had been silenced for generations. Through a simple act of curiosity and care, she uncovered more than bricks and beams. She uncovered a truth that demanded to be remembered. The lesson here isn't just about courage or compassion, it's about responsibility. We all walk on land shaped by those who came before us. Some were celebrated. Others, like Lydia Thompson and her family, were erased, forgotten. But if we listen, really listen, we can be the ones who bring those stories back into the light. Because the past is never just the past. It's part of us. It waits for someone willing to ask, who was here and why didn't we remember them? The end? Up next, 2 more incredible stories waiting to move your heart. Click to continue this journey and hit subscribe if you believe every voice deserves to be heard.